Well, when I give a talk in a place like this, I'm always reminded of this famous quote by Isaac Newton. If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. Well, I haven't really seen that far, and I'm not claiming that I've done anything that great, but I have certainly stood on the shoulders of giants. And some of the giants I'd like to thank at the onset are obviously my family in Ellensburg, my kids and my wife, my colleagues at Central Washington University who put up a lot with me being gone, or working on the book and doing field work, have helped take up the slack of missed responsibilities. My students have been a real joy. It's so much fun to have students to share what you learn with and to sort of carry the torch, so to speak. Friends and other colleagues, this person here, Tom Wewant, an incredible photographer, took many of the photographs I'll show to you today, and many of the photographs in my book. And then, of course, the gentleman that Joe mentioned, Charles Lowe, who was my mentor at the University of Arizona, who passed away a few years ago. Those and many others, and especially I want to thank you, Zoo Atlanta, tonight. Big thanks to Joe for inviting me, for being so gracious and spending time with me today. To Bridget Clifton for helping get this all set up. To Brad Locke, who's not here tonight, but Brad has been working on Project Heloderma, and Brad's the veterinarian and reptile curator here at the zoo. And to David and Ed, sorry I didn't get your last names. They took me all over the zoo today and spent a lot of time with me. And especially also thanks to you guys for showing up for this talk. And there's David and Ed with two of the most beautiful animals in the universe here at Zoo Atlanta. And Joe said it, but maybe he's biased because he works here. But I'll tell you, as a person who's studied these animals my whole life, this is an incredible place for beaded lizards, especially because you have the largest collection of the southernmost subspecies, Heloderma horridum Charles Bogart. I'll talk a little bit about them. And not only that, but other subspecies of beaded lizards. And this is a really great opportunity for you guys to get to actually see these animals in person. It's a real treat for me and a real honor to be here. So, for those of us who study creepy, crawly animals, and even plants, people often ask the question, especially when we're talking about threatened or endangered species, they'll say, well, what good is that? Why should we care? We've got how many millions of plants and animals on the earth. What if we lose one? So what? What good is that? I used to get that question. Well, I still do. Well, when I started my graduate work back in the early 80s, this is my study site in southwestern Utah, where I studied Gila monsters, where things started. In Utah, people would often ask me, I'm out there radio tracking Gila monsters in the desert. I'm so excited. This was the first time anyone had actually done field work on these animals. And they would look at me funny and they'd say, why are you doing that? Why don't you get a real job? Why don't you become a doctor or do something useful? What good is a venomous lizard? And the question caught me off guard often, and I would just say, well, they're cool. Why shouldn't we know all we can? But there was something about that question. I never felt happy about my answer, because all I could do was to share my enthusiasm and not really give a person an answer that really answered their question. And I began to think over the years that part of those questions we all ask come from ignorance, and especially for venomous animals. And I think Gila monsters and beaded lizards, venomous lizards, are a great example, because not all people are afraid of them. They're lizards, after all. They have legs. They don't slither. They walk. And so, but yet they're still venomous. And this ignorance we often have about things we don't know, creates fear, especially of venomous animals. Whereas when we get to know more about whether it's a critter or a person or a foreign country or anything, knowledge creates respect. And I think the more we know, the less we fear about things. And that quote I remember from another of my mentors and giants, this gentleman here named Jim Glenn, who was a venom researcher at the VA hospital in Salt Lake in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, when I was a kid. Jim's passed away now, but I had the fortune when I was a kid, this little guy here, I was about your age. Where's Dylan? I was about your age, Dylan, in this picture. watching Jim do surgery on a western diamondback rattlesnake. The man next to him is my father, who is also a researcher at VA hospital. He's also passed on. But I never forgot that advice from Jim. Ignorance creates fear, whereas knowledge creates respect. So let me tell you a short tale of some very cool lizards, and then maybe we'll come back to that theme. Well, we have two species in one family of lizards. So a pretty small family with only one genus and two different species. The people used to call these guys Mexican beaded lizards. They're not only Mexican beaded lizards because we have the Guatemalan beaded lizard. So we call them beaded lizards, Heloderma horridum, and the Gila monster, Heloderma suspectum. If I walk back, I hope you can hear me okay. Heloderma horridum is more of a dry forest, tropical animal, and Gila monsters are more of a desert animal. So these are the only venomous lizards in the world. This is the Rio Grijalva Valley in southern Chiapas, Mexico. Lagarto enchaquirado literally means beaded lizard. I affectionately call them bumpy lizards. And you'll know why we call them bumpy lizards. If you look at the skin of a beaded lizard, you'll notice that the scales are each impregnated with a little bit of bone. They're called osteoderms, bony scales. In fact, their scientific name, Heloderma, is Greek for a nail stud, which means studded skin, basically. And so that's where they get their name, beaded lizard. The monster part, these are photographs of Gila monsters along the Gila River. The Gila monster part comes from where the first animals were noticed in the 1800s along the Gila River, which courses through southwestern New Mexico and into Arizona. So one thing different about the two species, apart from their habitats and their size, are that beaded lizards have red tongues. This is a beautiful Alvarezi in a tree in Chiapas, Mexico. I'll show you some more slides of him. This is a Gila monster in Nevada. Gila monsters have black tongues and beaded lizards have red tongues. Don't forget that. You'll be quizzed later. Here's the distribution of these animals. So as Joe mentioned, I started my master's work way up here. If you can see this pointer, up in the northern part of the range, southwestern Utah. Gila monsters are found throughout a little chunk of the Mojave Desert in here, the Sonoran Desert of Arizona and Sonora, Mexico, a little piece of the Chihuahuan Desert here in southwestern New Mexico. Chihuahuan Desert, yeah. Yeah, looks like the dog was named after that too. And beaded lizards pick up the northern part of the range. There's actually an area in southern Sonora, Mexico, right in here, where the two species are sympatric. Their ranges overlap. Beaded lizards tend to be more relegated to the tropical dry forest, and Gila monsters more into desert habitats. So beaded lizards pick up here in southern Sonora, Mexico, and they follow the western slope, the Pacific drainage, all the way down in Mexico through tropical dry forest, down into Chiapas, and all the way into the Motagua Valley of Guatemala. And it's these animals from the Motagua Valley that have been an active interest of Zoo Atlanta to try to develop a breeding program to help perhaps even bring animals back into the wild from habitat that's been lost and destroyed in southeastern Guatemala. So it's a pretty big range of habitats, all in some amazing country, tropical dry forests and deserts of the southwestern U.S. and tropical dry forests of Mexico and Guatemala. So these I call portraits of populations. This gives you a little snapshot of the variation in these lizards, and especially in their patterns. And it also gives me an opportunity to show you 83 photographs of Gila monsters and beaded lizards in only 3 slides. So I can, the more the better, right? So you probably can't see these tiny red dots, but here's an example of Charles Bogardi, the southernmost subspecies that we have here at Atlanta Zoo. Notice on the tails of these lizards, these really distinctive tail bands. 2 yellow bands with a black band in the center. That's a real diagnostic trait of Charles Bogardi, the southernmost race. So it's Heloderma horridum Charles Bogardi. I'll just call him Charles Bogardi. Named after famous herpetologist Charles Bogart. And then a little farther north, we have an example of these animals as well. These are the Rio Grijalva Valley beaded lizard, Heloderma horridum alvarezi. These guys are interesting because some of them are pure black, jet black. They have almost no pattern at all. Here's an example in this animal. Here you'll see a live example of these beaded lizards. And as we move farther north, then we pick up more speckling in the lizards. So this population is from Jalisco, Mexico, a place I lived for a few years while I was doing my PhD work. You can see a lot more yellow speckling in these animals. And as we move north, even more yellow speckling in the patterns of these animals, and especially in the tails. And we also have a specimen of this animal, the Rio Fuerte beaded lizard, from southern Sonora that you'll get to see. So lots of variation. We've done some genetic work. I've worked with some colleagues. They've actually done most of the genetic analysis, and I collected tissue samples for them. And we found that there's so much genetic variation within these different, what are now subspecies or races of beaded lizards, that these two might be elevated to species status, and these two, Alvarezi and Charles Bogardi, might be separated from the others. So genetically they're very different. They look pretty similar, but genetically they're very different. So here's some pictures of Gila monsters, just giving you an idea of all the ranges in the variation in their patterns. Down here in Mexico, this is Hermosillo, Mexico, in southeastern Arizona, real dark individuals. These are called the reticulate Gila monsters, more mottled patterns. And as you move farther north, they generally tend to get lighter. As you move into northern Arizona, you start to pick up banded individuals. And there's a subspecies called the banded Gila monster that was named after this banded pattern. And then as we move farther north still, we into Nevada and southwestern Utah, you can really see there these kind of chain-like double cross bands on the body. The early herpetologists who studied these animals decided these northern animals were actually a different race, a different subspecies based on this banding, and they called them the banded Gila monster. But based on genetic analysis we've done and some ecological work in southwestern New Mexico, way down in the southern end, and in Utah, it's interesting. For example, in Utah, some of the animals are dark, like they look like they came from southern Arizona or Mexico, like this animal that I actually discovered in a lava flow, in black lava rock. And some of the animals from the southern end that are supposed to be lighter and banded in New Mexico, the southern end that are supposed to be darker and more mottled, have bands on them, like this individual is very banded. So you can see there's a lot of variation within the populations, and it turns out the genetic analysis shows these animals from southern Utah are more similar to the animals in southern New Mexico than they are to any of the other Gila monsters. So, what's up with that? Well, there's a lot of things about these lizards that lead me to believe this quote by Chris Christopherson is the perfect description for Helodermatid lizards. They are indeed a walking contradiction, partly truth and partly fiction. And we can think of a lot of people who fit that description as well. But there probably aren't two different subspecies of these animals. And the more we learn about them, the more we realize how easy it is to based on just a little bit of information, how easy it is to overinterpret what you see. So I want to talk with you a little bit about some of these walking contradictions that I think are kind of cool. For one, Gila monsters and beaded lizards are widely searching foragers. What does that mean? Well, they have to look pretty hard. They have to wander far and wide to find the food that they feed on. They can't just sit and wait for food to come to them. They feed they're specialists on the nests of vertebrates. Almost entirely. Beaded lizards will sometimes eat beetle larvae, insect prey, but almost entirely they'll feed on vertebrate nests. This is a beaded lizard in tropical dry forest in southern Sonora who's found a dove nest. You see his open, look at that. There's that bulging eye we were talking about earlier. Look what I found. So they have to to find vertebrate nests, it's not easy to find a nest. They're not going to come to you. You have to search far and wide. It takes a widely searching foraging strategy, and that takes energy. Yet, over 95% of the time, of their time is spent in shelters. From radiotelemetry work I've done in Utah and in Mexico and in Arizona and in New Mexico, in most populations, over 95% of their time is spent in shelters. In some animals that are most active, populations outside of Phoenix, they spend only 92% of their time in shelters. So, here they are, they search far and wide for prey, yet they spend most of their time just sitting there doing nothing inside of shelters. So what's up with that? I mean, how can they do that? No other lizards that we've known before can be widely searching foragers, spend all their time sitting in shelters. Well, for one, they can eat large meals. And here's a Gila monster in southern Utah that I was radio tracking this animal, and I watched him digging under a creosote bush into this depression in the ground. I was like, what's up with that? I'm watching him, and I hear all this squeaking, and I see him disappear in there. Like any good field biologist, I reached in there with my hand, pulled him out by the tail, and he's got this rabbit in his mouth. And I carefully reached in and pulled out the rest of the rabbits from the nest, and I weighed them all. And I had just weighed the lizard the day before because I've been radio tracking him. And he weighed about 600 grams, and the 4 bunnies that he ate weighed over 200 grams. So in a single meal, this lizard ate equivalent to 1/3 of his body mass. That's about 1/3 of his annual energy budget in one feeding event. I mean, imagine if you could do that. It would be like eating 30 or 40 Big Macs in one sitting and not having to eat again for about 3 or 4 months. So that's pretty amazing. They can eat huge meals, like snakes can. They also can store energy in their body cavities, in fat bodies, along the reproductive organs, and in their tail. And here's what a wild Gila monster looks like. That's in pretty good shape. They got pretty good sized tails. A lot of fat gets stored there. And here's an especially healthy Gila monster here at Zoo Atlanta, and you can see how much they can put away in their tail. I mean, and it doesn't take much. You don't have to feed them very much. If you have them, anyone who's kept them in captivity knows they don't take much food to really be able to save a lot of energy. How can they do that? Well, they have very low metabolic rates. You don't have to worry about these graphs unless you like these kinds of things. But it shows the relationship between body mass and metabolic rate in lizards. And if you look at this line, this shows all the lizards that have been measured, their metabolic rates in relation to their body mass. And then if you look at Gila lizards, they're all under the line. And this is a bigger difference than you think, because this axis here is logarithmic axis. So these guys have about less than half the metabolic rate of other lizards of equivalent size. And even among different ecological groups of lizards that are fossorial, for example, lizards that spend time underground and are less active, tend to have lower metabolic rates, or reclusive lizards tend to have lower metabolic rates. Gila lizards have even lower metabolic rates than all those others. So they have very low metabolic rates. They use that energy that they store very slowly. And they can eat, so then they can eat 3 or 4 large meals, like equivalent to that one in Utah that ate the rabbits, can fulfill their entire energy demands for a year. Now if they're growing and reproducing, then they would need more, but 3 meals in a year. 3 meals a year is that's pretty amazing. So also, colleagues at Arizona State University have found that Gila monsters are unique among lizards in that they store water in their urinary bladder. Tortoises can do this. It's like a canteen. And not only can they store fat in their tail, but they store water in their bladder, and they can use their bladder as a canteen. They can actually take that water up across the bladder. We can't do that. We can't drink a whole lot, store it in our bladder, and then go out in the desert and use it. Our bladder just won't do that. So it's pretty amazing that these lizards have these adaptations, and that makes them particularly well suited to living in harsh seasonal environments. It may not rain an entire year in the desert, in the Sonoran Desert, some areas. They may have to go an entire year without feeding, and they can easily do that. Beaded lizards have to wait out periods 5, 6, 8 months of drought. They have to get by without any food for long periods. And so because of these traits, they're they're fairly well suited, even though they have to search far and wide to find their food. So that's kind of cool. So here's another walking contradiction. Okay, these are widely searching lizards. They have to wander far. And most lizards, when you imagine a lizard, and you're out, you're walking around, you see a lizard, you think of a lizard that runs really fast and scutters to safety when it sees you. These lizards are the opposite. They can't run fast. However, if you put them on a treadmill, in case you're thinking about doing this, you put them on a treadmill and you measure their oxygen consumption. You know, people do that with elite athletes. Well, we herpetologists, we do it with lizards. And you get them on a treadmill, you get them going, and you measure their metabolic rates as they're going. These guys can go for hours and hours at slow speeds on a treadmill, longer than any other lizards measured, except for some monitor lizards. Varana lizards, like that big Varanus that hits here at the zoo, that big monitor lizard. So they can go hours and hours on a treadmill. They just don't tire out, yet they're not very fast. Their mean pace of foraging in nature is about 1/4 kilometer an hour, about as fast as I'm walking right now. And their top speed is about maybe like this, fast. And you can see, you know, this guy, this is just about top speed right now. There he goes. It's kind of like the front and the back half haven't figured out that they're going the same direction. They're not fast. They don't run fast. That's not the strategy they use to escape predators. Yet they have this amazing endurance. They can go for hours and hours on a treadmill. People have always interpreted that in the past as an adaptation for foraging. Well, this doesn't make sense in these guys. They also have high aerobic capacities. This is cool. So you've heard about VO2 max in elite athletes, right? You know, elite athletes can up their metabolic rate like 10 times their resting levels when they're active. I mean, that's pretty amazing. Humans can do that. Well, Gila monsters and beaded lizards can increase their metabolic rate 35-fold from when they're resting to when they're active, moving. It's amazing. They have among the highest aerobic capacities. So that's their ability to sustain activity without going anaerobic, using oxygen. They have some of the highest aerobic capacities of any lizard measured. And if you look at this graph, I don't know how well you can see it, there's an open circle up here. These are other lizards. These are the monitor lizards, like Varanus, like that big Komodo dragon they have here. So beaded lizards and Gila monsters are right up there with Komodo dragons in their aerobic capacities. Yet they have low metabolic rates and they spend all this time underground. Okay, what's up with that? Well, here we need to look at something other than foraging behavior to answer that question. They have these amazing combat rituals. They wrestle for access to mates. So this is from the cover of my Gila monster book. Here's 2 Gila monsters wrestling, and this is a female poking her head out of a shelter. This is actually a painting. It's not a photograph. It almost looks like a photograph. So males will wrestle for access to females during the breeding season. Kind of a new twist on lizard behavior. And I want to show you some movies. So let me bring up some Gila monster movies here. Now, I hope this won't overwhelm your senses, but since we're all used to watching CNN and multitasking, I'm just gonna give you an appreciation of the intensity of these wrestling matches by playing all 4 of these at once. Now, this is a combat interaction observed by one of my students in southern Nevada that went on for 8 hours. And the lizards rested, off and on between these matches. These guys are hanging out in the shade when it got hot. They're still fighting. They're fighting here. They're fighting here. These are intensive, ritualized grappling matches. Basically, what happens is they go through these bouts, and whatever animal ends up on top at the end of a wrestling bout wins that bout. And they'll do dozens and dozens of these bouts over a few hours. The one that ends up on top through most of the bouts is the one that gets access to the female. No, it's more wrestling. It's not. They do some biting, but mostly it's ritualized wrestling, kind of reminiscent of Indian leg wrestling. Really interesting. And these bouts, as you can see, they're pretty strenuous. And so I think the explanation for their high aerobic capacities isn't to be able to go out and find food, but it's for the males to get females. Leave it to the males, right? They always come up with, the fighting stuff, right? So that's kind of cool. And interestingly, if you look at lizards, there are very few lizards that have these ritualized wrestling postures for access to females. Other groups of lizards, like iguanas, iguanine lizards, they fight, but they bite and they posture, but they don't wrestle like this. It's only in the helodermatid lizards, the monitor lizards, and some of the alligator lizards that have these ritualized wrestling bouts. That's the group of lizards that branched from the same line of reptiles that gave rise to the snakes. In fact, these lizards have closer evolutionary ties to snakes than they do to most other lizards. And snakes, interestingly, go through similar kinds of twisting and entwining postures when they grapple and when they fight for resources. And so this is sort of a telling reminder of the evolutionary ties between this cool group of lizards and the snakes. They truly are more like snakes on legs than they are like lizards. And combat in beaded lizards, that we have here at Zoo Atlanta, is even more interesting. The lizards will start out in a straddle posture. One male will climb on top of the other, and they'll move around in the straddle posture like Gila monsters do. And then they press their sides against each other and form an arch. We call it the horridum arch. And when they make this arch, they'll only have the tips of their tails and the tips of their snouts and sometimes their limbs touching the ground. They form this arch and they press against each other. I don't know how well you can see this in these drawings, but I'll show you a film of it in a minute. And they press against each other. And again, the animal that can form the higher arch, that might be bigger and stronger and has more endurance, is able to collapse the arch and end up on top the end of each bout. And that's the lizard that keeps access to a breeding territory and has access to females. Pretty cool stuff. And these can also go on for hours and hours. And this is a photograph of the horridum arch of the animals. This was the first time this has been photographed. It's been drawn. I was lucky enough to see it on a dirt road in Mexico in the 80s, or the late 80s. And it had never really been captured on film until here at Zoo Atlanta. With the BBC's help, these guys got some amazing photographs of the beaded lizard arch. And so I've got to show you. You have to. Anybody here seen this? Oh, hey. Now the sound isn't working. Hang on a sec. See if I can. I'm not sure that this will.
Mexican beaded lizard.
Can you hear it?
One of the few lizards in the world with a poisonous bite. And very virulent one it is too. In the spring, rival males fight, according to a very specific set of rules.
So this was filmed here at Zoo Atlanta by the BBC. Amazing footage.
They use neither their sharp, powerful claws nor their poisonous bite in their battles. At first, they grapple rather warily to assess each other's strength. Then they begin to wrestle in earnest, each trying to pin down the other on the ground.
There it is.
These two are evenly matched. Neither can get the crucial throw. It's rather like an arm wrestling contest, and the bout can continue for several hours.
Notice those tail bands? Look at that. This is the only time it's been filmed.
The eventual winner is the one who ends up on top most frequently. It's a controlled test of strength in which, despite their lethal weaponry, no one gets seriously hurt.
Pretty cool, huh? And when I was writing the book, I tried for years to get some footage of this unsuccessfully. And it's pretty cool that here at Zoo Atlanta they were able to get that film. So we did an analysis of, I thought maybe because of these arches that they formed during combat, maybe some people in Mexico noticed that males had, the tips of their tails were often beat up. And we started wondering, well, maybe having a longer tail in males might serve as an advantage. We found in a sample of a large number of lizards that male beaded lizards actually have longer tails, slightly longer tails than females. So all of these fights, these ritualized wrestling matches that go on in these lizards, usually happen near a shelter where a female is resting. In the times where we've actually been radio tracking animals, we know where other animals are. It's always been near a shelter where after the bout, the winner can go in and mate with the female. It happens during the mating season. So shelters are a real important part of the social structure and for reproduction in these lizards. Shelters, I mean, but cracks and crevices underground where they spend most of their time. So we set off to do a study on microhabitat and the importance of shelters in New Mexico. I'm going to move through this kind of quickly because I'm realizing we're getting a little bit short on time. And show you this is an amazing place in southwestern New Mexico. We marked several animals, 20 or so Gila monsters, and within a certain area, this is a kilometer here for scale, we put radio transmitters and followed these animals for 6 years and marked all the shelters they used. And found that they don't just use any old hole in the ground. Notice in this aerial photo, you can see some shelters are clustered in some areas, and there aren't shelters in other areas. There aren't Gila monsters in other areas. Each dot is an individual animal, and each color is a different individual. So they tend to pick habitat areas where there's an availability of suitable shelters. If there aren't cracks and crevices and nooks and crannies in the ground, you won't find them in a place. These animals evolved in tropical environments, and they have this legacy of a leaky skin. Interestingly, even though they live in dry forest and in deserts today, they have high rates of water loss across the skin. Most lizards don't lose much water across the skin. Gila monsters and beaded lizards do. And because of that, we got interested in, okay, in these shelters, what's the microenvironment like in there? Are they picking shelters that are more humid, or do they try to conserve their water by picking different shelters? And I won't go into too much detail here. Suffice it to say that it gets really dry at a certain time of year in the summer before the rains come in their desert habitats. Really variable habitats. And it turns out that during the driest time of year, we call the dry summer in the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts, they use shelters that are more soil-like, that retain the humidity better. And in the winter, they use shelters that are on rocky slopes facing south that stay warmer. And if you look at the microenvironments, those data loggers that we used inside of these shelters, we find that the shelters that they use during the hottest, driest time of year are significantly moister down here, have higher relative humidity, and are cooler than the other shelters. And there's sort of this idea that herpetologists have always been real interested in temperature, how lizards and snakes regulate their temperature. Well, it turns out for these animals, because they have leaky skins, water is perhaps more important in determining how they use habitat. So that's kind of a cool discovery. And they also show amazing fidelity to reused shelters. For example, this blue animal, this is showing the home ranges of 6 of our Gila monsters in New Mexico. This blue lizard, came back to the same shelter I'm pointing at. Just a little crevice in the ground, you'd never notice it. 6 years in a row, it came back to that same little hole in the ground. They'll forage in the very same areas year after year. They have an amazing ability to go back to places where they've been before. And if you take a Gila monster from a habitat it's used to, and you move it, say, 10 miles away outside of its home range, in most cases it'll perish. It imprints at a fairly young age on habitat. You move them away and they have a very hard time readjusting. And mating also takes place within shelters. So these animals are a lot more social than we previously thought. We just thought they wandered around on their own. They don't. They know what's going on in their habitat, and they can recognize others of their own species. So for the second part of my talk, I want to talk about the venom system of bumpy lizards. For one, we've told you they're the only venomous lizards. There's been found evidence that other lizards have the genes to make venom, but they don't have a venom apparatus like Gila monsters and beaded lizards do, so they can't really deliver the venom to a bite. And their venom system is very different than snakes. Snakes have hollow fangs, hypodermic needle-like fangs, and so when a snake bites, it injects the venom through those hollow fangs. It has musculature around the venom sacs that can squeeze those sacs, at least in vipers, that can inject the venom into the wound. Gila monsters and beaded lizards have a very different system. They have a series of glands in the lower jaw rather than the upper jaw like snakes, and they have grooved teeth rather than hollow fangs. So when they bite to deliver the venom, they sort of have to chew the venom into the wound. It moves through these grooved teeth by capillary action. It's very effective. It gets deposited just fine, thank you, but it doesn't get injected into the system. What happens is they'll open and close their mouths a few times. You'll probably see it in these lizards tonight. If they, well, maybe they'll be inside. They might not get too worked up. And they'll bathe their teeth in venom, and then when they bite, then they deposit the venom. It's very important for defense. Its primary use ecologically for these lizards isn't so much to process prey, like snakes use their venom to even pre-digest their prey. Gila monsters and beaded lizards use their venom for defense, to ward off potential predators. And it's very effective for defense, except for this poor guy that got swallowed by a king snake. Predators are really important. This was actually a friend of mine, Matt Good, was out in the desert, and he saw this king snake constricting a baby Gila monster, ran back to his car to get his camera and got this shot just as the Gila monster was going down the hatch. You can just see a little part of its toe as it goes down. Kind of sad. But and this animal probably lost its tail to a coyote or a kit fox, or some predators. So predators are very important, and the venom system is built to discourage predators. It's got a number of compounds that work as predator deterrents. Don't worry about the names of all these things, obviously, but these are just names of a few of the peptides and proteins that are found in Gila monster and beaded lizard venom that are all about pain and spreading pain and causing swelling. These kallikrein-like peptides, they're called. What they do is they get the inflammation response going. So you get bitten, these peptides get into the bloodstream and into the skin, and they cause pain both at the local level. They activate the peripheral receptors, but they also send signals to the central nervous system that cause pain throughout the body. So you can get bitten on your hand by a Gila monster. I wouldn't advise it. And you'll feel pain in the other arm or down in your legs. You'll feel pain everywhere. It's all about pain. They knock out blood pressure. They have peptides that cause hypotension. They cause your blood vessels to be leaky so that fluid moves out of your blood vessels and your blood pressure drops. Incredible swelling. They won't kill you. The venom is not lethal. Bites to humans are very rare. But the bite is so painful, it might make you feel like death is the preferred alternative. And I've never been bitten. I'm going to knock on wood. I got nicked on the knuckle by a beaded lizard once. But I have friends who have been, and I've seen people bitten. And it's not a pretty sight. Usually bites are the result of careless handling, or like this fool who's dancing with a Gila monster in Tevas. Not a good idea. So because they're venomous, there's been some great folklore and stories about Gila monsters and beaded lizards. If anyone ever gets a chance to see this movie, The Giant Gila Monster, anybody ever seen it here in the audience? It's pretty bad, isn't it? It's really bad. It's in the era of the 60s or the 50s, 1958. This movie is made. There's a problem with this, though. Aside from the fact that Gila monsters don't get quite that big, what's the problem? Yeah, the tongue is red. It should be. Gila monsters have black tongues, don't they? Interestingly, the animal they used in this movie was a beaded lizard and not a Gila monster. And there are a few other problems with the movie, but if you get a chance to watch it, it's kind of turned into a cult movie. It's pretty funny. And then there's the monster Helen, the giant Gila monster that invaded St. George. I love these because they're from my home state of Utah, and it shows, you know, the Gila monster invading St. George, where a lot of their habitat is being lost. This one, a friend gave to me. He was visiting a Star Wars museum in Portland, and he saw this. This was a sketch drawn up as an idea for one of the Star Wars movies that was never used, one of those creepy creatures in Star Wars. But it's pretty scary, isn't it? And it's obviously based on a Gila monster. They called it Gilad. Never made it into the movies. Maybe that's a good thing. And then there's this novel I read in graduate school called Gila by Les Simmons. And it reads, "You'll never know what real fear is until you're caught in the flesh-rending, bone-splintering jaws of Gila." And it even shows blood dripping from the teeth of this lizard. It gets into a carnival and does all these horrible things. And so this is fiction. We're okay with that. People, they like to take our fears and exploit them. But this is an actual drawing from a scientific paper, American Museum of Natural History. This is an artist's depiction of a fossil helodermatid, a fossil relative of Gila monsters and beaded lizards. It's in that same group called the Monstersauria. Aesthesia, this is a 77 million-year-old fossil. They found frontal bones, part of the skull, and they found teeth that were grooved that suggested it had a venom system. It had osteoderms. It was very similar to beaded lizards and Gila monsters we have today. They found the fossil of this Aesthesia in association with eggs of Protoceratops dinosaurs. These dinosaurs were around before there was Triceratops dinosaurs. So this is an old fossil. And because they knew that these Protoceratops actually laid eggs in nests, in groups, then the artist came up with this scenario of this ancient relative of a Gila monster and beaded lizard eating these defenseless dinosaurs. And if you look, you can even see the blood dripping from the teeth. So, even scientists have bought into this, building on our fear, or making these animals look sinister. So I want to close with this cool story about Heloderma and medicine. This takes us back to about the time these animals were discovered. Beaded lizards were, or at least by the Western world, they were first described by Francisco Hernandez, who was a great explorer and described a lot of reptile species in Latin America in the 1500s. And you can read this quote, but basically it's saying that the meat of these guys is an aphrodisiac. Now, of course, back in the 1500s, Spanish explorers thought lots of things were aphrodisiacs, I suppose. But it's an interesting piece of history that lives on in the legends of these animals. And then about 400 years later, this guy, Dr. Bucock, comes on the scene. And he's a homeopathic practitioner. Now, this actually isn't a photograph or a picture of Dr. Bucock. I couldn't find a picture of him, but this is a picture of one of his colleagues that I thought, maybe this is what he looked like. I don't know. But he published these papers that people thought were really funny, where he took, the whole idea of homeopathic medicine is small quantities of a substance might give you symptoms that you can cure with even smaller quantities of a substance. So he made up this sugar and milk mixture of Heloderma venom, and then he took them, he ate them, he injected them, he did all these things with these provings, they're called. And then he wrote these papers about how it enhanced his sexual performance and all these sexual innuendos. And people joked about him, partly because of his unusual name and because of the descriptions of the aphrodisiac qualities of the venom. And so it's kind of a funny thing. People made fun of Dr. Bucock. But here's the truth, which can sometimes be stranger than the folklore. So 100 years afterwards, now in the 1980s, aside from those nasty peptides in the venom that cause great pain I talked about, there's a very intriguing group of peptides that have been recently discovered that mimic human hormones. And I've got highlighted here 3 of them. Don't worry about these names and all the information. But basically, they're called exendins because they come from exocrine glands, salivary glands, but they have endocrine action. They act like hormones, mammalian hormones. A couple of them these actually Xendin 3 and 2 and 1, these three that are highlighted, mimic a hormone called vasoactive intestinal peptide, which is a hormone that works in our gut, and it helps us to reabsorb water across the gut. It mediates smooth muscle activity and water uptake across the gut. And it mimics this human hormone, which people thought was kind of interesting. But it's also been found, it binds to breast cancer cells, so there's been some work with it to try to help locate breast cancer and lung cancers. And this one, called helospectin, was discovered in the 80s. And people were finding it in all these tissues, and it mediates blood flow in these tissues. And pharmacologists got really interested in it. And it points to some very, very strange and very intimate connections between people and lizards. In fact, these connections are so intimate, I'm embarrassed to read the titles of these papers that are published in respectable pharmacology journals, the Journal of Regulatory Peptides. Here's helospectin recently isolated from the poisonous saliva of the American lizard, they call it. They find it in some pretty interesting places. And they find it, other researchers find it in some other really interesting places, and they're all interested in investigating what role these peptides from lizard venom, they're the same peptides from lizard venom that are found in our most intimate places of our anatomy. What are these things doing? Well, pharmacologists are really interested because they've certainly made a lot of money off of Viagra. So far, Gila monster venom hasn't led to anything that much of a breakthrough in this realm of pharmacology, at least anyway. But it makes you wonder, if maybe Dr. Bucock might have been onto something. Who knows? But the most famous peptide found in the venom of Gila monsters and beta lizards is called Xendin 4. It's now been developed into a drug, and I want to tell you a cool story about this drug. And to do that, I need to give you a little bit of background about carbohydrate metabolism and diabetes. So this peptide, discovered in the 80s, called Xendin 4, it induces insulin release through, I'll tell you about it. Let's talk a little a bit about diabetes first, back up. So there's, diabetes is very common. 17 million Americans, more than 17 million Americans have type 2 diabetes, adult onset diabetes, which basically makes it difficult to process carbohydrates. What happens after a meal, we've had those nice snacks outside. In a normal person, our blood sugar might spike a little bit after 20 minutes or so, and then it'll go down. In a diabetic, the blood sugar just keeps going up because they can't secrete insulin to pick up that blood sugar. So if we look at what's going on physiologically, you have these cells called beta cells in the pancreas. And when blood glucose goes up after a meal, it tells the beta cells to release insulin to help us use that sugar. Reduces the sugar concentration, we take it in, and we can do the things we need to do. People who have diabetes, their beta cells don't work, they don't respond to increased glucose, or they don't have beta cells, as many beta cells, and so they can't produce insulin, and they go through this problem of having high blood sugar. So in order to manage the disease, they have to take insulin shots. Well, there's another human hormone, that was discovered in the 60s. You don't hear much about it. It's called glucagon-like peptide. It's not the same as glucagon for those physiologists in the group. But glucagon-like peptide also induces insulin release from the pancreas. But it only works when blood glucose is high. So insulin will cause you to will reduce your blood sugar whether it's high or low in any case. And it can be a problem for diabetics because if you take insulin when your blood sugar is already kind of low, it can cause hypoglycemia, which is very dangerous. When people discovered this peptide, GLP-1, they got excited about it. It's a human peptide hormone. It also acts on the nervous system to signal a sense of fullness, so your appetite is reduced and you don't gain weight, which is a problem in diabetes. People got very excited about it as for treating diabetes. But they couldn't get it to work because it's destroyed by an enzyme. I love saying that dipeptidyl peptidase 4. This weird enzyme humans have breaks down this promising hormone that they're unable to do anything with. But, it's in the literature. So along comes the 1980s, this researcher, Dr. John Ang, who discovers in Gila monster venom Xendin 4, this peptide, that mimics the human hormone GLP-1. Now, John Ng was working at a VA hospital in the Bronx, just playing around in his lab, doing basic science, trying to understand how physiology works. And he was interested in animal venoms because he wanted to look at receptors for different peptides in mammals. Well, he discovers this exendin 4, and it mimics that human hormone GLP-1, so it induces insulin release, but only when blood glucose is elevated, which is really important for treating diabetes. It acts on the central nervous system to signal a sense of fullness. This has led to a whole new understanding of the link between the central nervous system and the gut. Pretty cool research going on there. But it's not destroyed by that human enzyme, dipeptidyl peptidase 4. So it's immune to the enzyme. It's a little bit different. Its molecular structure is different than the human hormone GLP-1. So it's immune to our human enzyme, so it lasts in the body. And he got very excited about this, and he told his colleagues at the VA hospital, look, this is something that could treat diabetes. And the VA is like, we don't have time to deal with this. Go do something else. And he wouldn't let it go. So he patented it. He went to conferences year after year. So this was in the mid-'80s. And after a few years, he got a pharmaceutical company, Amylin Pharmaceuticals, a small company in San Diego, interested. And Amylin helped to develop this into a drug, and they did all this testing. Took years. In 2002, this is about the time I was writing this book, suddenly Eli Lilly, big pharmaceutical company, plunks down $325 million to help bring this drug to market, turn it into a drug and bring it to market. I'm going to skip that. And in April of 2005, the drug, exendin 4, they called it exenatide as they were developing it, it received FDA approval as a drug to help treat type 2 diabetes. And it's distributed under the trade name Byada. Has anybody heard about this drug? Well, and here's just some data that shows, yes, if you eat a standardized breakfast, whatever that is, steak and eggs, maybe no, maybe I don't. You eat a breakfast. If you're diabetic and you don't take anything, your blood sugar spikes. But if you take Byada, it'll lower your blood sugar, and it also helps people lose weight because it reduces appetite. Pretty exciting, and it also works when your blood sugar's already high, even if you haven't eaten recently. Byada. People got pretty excited about this. And when it was approved by the FDA in 2005, analysts projected that the sales could reach 60 million and maybe even close to 200 million in 2006. Well, if you look at what's happened with this drug, in 2006, it sold almost $500 million. 2007, it sold well over half a billion dollars, $650 million. 2008, we don't know. But it's turned into a drug that is very exciting, and they actually think it has blockbuster potential. And I want to show you another funny video. See if I can get this to load up. Actually, I think I already did that. Let's see. Here we go. Now I might have to move the mic again.
Talk now, though, about some important healthcare headlines we had this morning. A once-a-week drug for diabetes may help you lose weight as well. That is good news this morning for shareholders of Amylin, Eli Lilly, and Alkermes. CNBC's pharmaceuticals reporter Mike Hochman back at HQ with more on what could be, it looks like a wonder solution.
Yeah, and a mega blockbuster, Aaron. One analyst calls this the most important and highly anticipated biotech data of the second half of this year, and many believe that this first-of-its-kind drug could become a $3 billion product over the next several years. Lilly, Amylin, and Alkermes are buddies on a once-a-week version of the diabetes drug Byada. Lilly and Amylin would make most of the money, and Alkermes would get a relatively small royalty for the technology that stretches the drug out over a week. Now, this is a new version of the twice-a-day injectable drug Byada from Lilly and Amylin. It's the one made with synthetic Gila monster saliva. Late-stage test results show a bigger cut in blood sugar levels than in a mid-stage test, and 3 out of 4 patients got their levels below the recommended benchmark. On average, they also lost about 8 pounds. Older diabetes drugs have made people gain weight. But it's about the same weight loss seen with twice-a-day Bieta, and that's why those stocks could be selling off this morning. And there was a 30% lower incidence of nausea, a common side effect with twice-a-day Bieta, although it's usually mild and it goes away. Amylin says it hopes to file for FDA approval of once-a-week Bieta by the end of the first half of 2009, but that it will try to speed things up if possible. On the conference call, the CEO, Dan Bradbury, called this the best blood sugar control and weight loss to be shown ever in a major test of a diabetes drug. Back to you.
The saliva of a Gila monster, Mike?
Synthetic, yes.
Synthetic?
Yes.
Synthetic Gila
saliva?
monsters? Saliva. Okay. The Bieta was injectable. Is this new one also injection?
Yeah, but it would require a much, much bigger needle mark, as you might expect. So you get it 2 times a day in the belly. This would be once a week
You're losing
in the
me.
belly.
You're losing
Once
me.
a week, he said, in the belly, you
Yeah, but
get
you
your
only have to
synthetic
do it
saliva.
once a week, Mark.
Oh, good. Yeah.
So, now wait a minute, we get out of sequence here. What happened? Back to our story. Somehow we got out. There we go. So, pretty interesting. Anyway, when the news came out about this drug in 2002, I was writing my book on Gila monsters and beaded lizards, and I saw this quote in the New York Times. Dr. Ng said that he still had never seen a Gila monster, didn't know why it had the compound in its venom. It's still a mystery, actually. But he had got his venom samples from a company in Utah. And I thought that was interesting, so I called him on the phone, and we've had lots of conversations. Well, it turned out he worked at a VA hospital in the Bronx. He got his venom samples, this was 1985, from Jim Glenn. VA hospital, Salt Lake, venom researcher in the mid-'80s. And Jim Glenn got his venom samples from Paradise Canyon, Gila monsters, because these were the animals that I was working on in the early 80s. And I collected these guys in particular. This was the dark Gila monster in the lava flow I mentioned earlier. He had some of these animals in his lab, and we had been milking them. And it was venom samples from these Utah Gila monsters sent to John Ng that led to the discovery of this diabetes drug that's helping to treat 18 million people who have type 2 diabetes. And if only I'd known back in 1982... if I could have told people, well, here's what good a venomous lizard is, there'll be a diabetes drug. If only I had known then what I know now, maybe I could have told them that story. So it just goes to show you, when you pick out something by itself, you find it hits to everything else in the universe. And this is a good friend, Antonio Ramirez in Chiapas, showing the beauty of these animals to kids, which you'll get to see today. We can all be kids after the talk and see these animals. So why do monsters matter? Why do any of these creepy crawly things matter? Well, for Gila monsters and beaded lizards, new discovery about these lizards have a lot to teach us about how animals adapt to harsh and extreme environments. They have a lot to teach us about connections, unexpected ones between us and nature. We're not separate, and we have no idea. We have no clue about all these amazing connections. If the venom from a Gila monster and beaded lizard can be found in some of the most intimate places of our anatomy, and if they play a role in the vital processes in our physiology, what other connections are there out there in animals that we're already losing, like amphibians and so many species? So they provide an awesome example of the value of biodiversity. Not that we should always use an excuse to say, well, animals and plants are worth something because of what they can do directly for us. But sometimes it doesn't hurt to remember these examples.